Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Nikki Newman does the unthinkable. She turns on her own son, Nick, attacking him in a desperate bid to untie and save Matt, a move that sends shockwaves through the Newman family and forces every character involved to confront the ugliest truths about loyalty, guilt, and the unbearable cost of silence, and it all unfolds in a single, breathless stretch of chaos where love and violence collide, secrets erupt, and Nikki's long-buried trauma finally detonates, because when Nikki storms into that dim, claustrophobic space and sees Matt bound, bloodied, and barely conscious, something inside her fractures beyond repair, overriding logic, morality, and even motherhood, pushing her to strike Nick not out of hatred but out of a tortured, desperate love that has been twisted by fear, regret, and years of emotional manipulation. And as Nick tries to explain, tries to reason, tries to hold her back, Nikki lashes out, her voice trembling, her hands shaking, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of fury and heartbreak, screaming that he doesn't understand, that none of them understand, and that if she doesn't act now, Matt will die and she will never forgive herself. And the horror of the moment isn't just that Nikki attacks Nick, but that, in her mind, she truly believes she has no other choice, and the first reason Nikki attacks Nick is rooted in raw maternal terror, a fear so primal it eclipses everything else. Because to Nikki, Matt is not just a man tied to a chair, he is a living embodiment of her past failures, her unresolved guilt, and her desperate need for redemption. And when she sees Nick standing there, blocking her path, hesitating, weighing consequences like a Newman always does, she sees not her son but an obstacle between life and death. And Nikki has spent her entire life losing people she loves, losing control to addiction, losing trust, losing herself. And in that moment her mind screams that hesitation equals death, that rules and explanations are luxuries they no longer have, that every second Nick delays is another second Matt's life drains away, and this terror transforms Nikki from a concerned mother into a force of nature, one that strikes without thinking because fear has hijacked her reason, and she attacks Nick not because she wants to hurt him but because she cannot bear to watch another man die while she stands frozen. And the second reason Nikki attacks Nick lies in the unbearable weight of guilt and buried secrets, because Matt is connected to something Nikki has never fully confessed, something that links her past to the present in a way that threatens to destroy her marriage, her family, and the carefully rebuilt image she's fought so hard to maintain. And as Nick questions the situation, demands answers, and insists on handling it the right way, Nikki hears echoes of every moment she stayed silent when she should have spoken up, every time she let Victor control the narrative, every time she convinced herself that protecting the family meant hiding the truth, and Matt knows too much, or suffered because she didn't act sooner. And seeing him tied up is like staring at a physical manifestation of her shame, and when Nick refuses to immediately untie him, Nikki feels judged, exposed, and cornered, as if her own son is unconsciously condemning her for the choices she made years ago, and that guilt erupts as anger, because it's easier to strike than to confess, easier to attack than to admit that she may have helped create the nightmare unfolding in front of them. And in that split second, Nikki's slap, shove, or strike against Nick is less about stopping him and more about silencing the voice inside her head that screams, "You did this." And the third and most devastating reason Nikki attacks Nick is her fractured belief that Nick has become too much like Victor, because as Nick stands there, trying to control the situation, trying to play strategist instead of rescuer, Nikki suddenly sees Victor's shadow looming over her son, and it terrifies her, because Victor has always believed that ends justify means that sacrifice is acceptable if it protects power, and that emotional restraint is weakness. And Nikki has loved Victor fiercely but suffered endlessly under that philosophy, and in that moment she believes Nick is making the same cold calculation. Who deserves saving? What risks are acceptable? What fallout can be managed? And she snaps, accusing Nick of choosing control over compassion, of thinking like a Newman CEO instead of a human being. And when she attacks him, it's as if she's striking Victor himself. Years of pent-up resentment finally exploding as she screams that she will not let another man she loves decide who lives and who dies. Not again. Not ever. And as Nikki pushes past Nick to untie Matt, the emotional fallout ripples outward instantly because Nick is left stunned. Not just physically hurt, but emotionally shattered, realizing that his own mother sees him as a potential monster. And Matt, barely able to speak, locks eyes with Nikki in a moment that's both grateful and terrifying, because saving him may cost Nikki everything. And as the ropes fall away and Matt collapses into her arms, Nikki's hands are slick with blood and tears, and she whispers apologies that are years overdue, while outside that room the consequences begin to gather like a storm. Because Victor will not forgive this betrayal of order, Victoria will demand answers, Sharon will see the cracks forming in Nick's heart, and the family will be forced to confront a truth they've long avoided. That love, when mixed with fear and secrecy, can become just as destructive as hatred, and Nikki attacking Nick becomes more than a shocking act of violence. It becomes a symbolic breaking point, a moment where the matriarch chooses emotion over empire, conscience over control, and one human life over the carefully balanced lies that have defined the Newmans for decades. And as the dust settles, no one walks away unchanged, because Nick must now question whether his instincts are truly his own or inherited from a father he both resists and resembles. Matt's survival threatens to unravel secrets that could rewrite multiple relationships, and Nikki, standing in the wreckage of her decision, must face the terrifying possibility that saving Matt may have cost her son's trust forever, making this one of the most powerful, tragic, and unforgettable moments The Young and the Restless has ever delivered. The aftermath of Nikki's shocking attack on Nick doesn't simply fade into silence or resolve itself with a few tearful apologies. Instead, it metastasizes into a slow-burning emotional catastrophe that seeps into every corner of the Newman family, because once Nikki unties Matt and chooses his life over Nick's authority, she crosses an invisible line that can never be fully erased. And the air itself seems heavier as reality settles in, with Nick staggering back not just from the physical blow, but from the realization that his own mother saw him as an enemy in a moment when he believed he was trying to protect everyone. And this fracture becomes the true heart of the story, because Nick has always been the Newman who balances instinct with empathy, the one who questions Victor's ruthlessness while still carrying the weight of the Newman legacy. And now he is forced to confront the horrifying idea that, in Nikki's eyes, he failed the most basic moral test, choosing immediate compassion over calculated caution. And as Nikki clings to Matt, sobbing, whispering that she's sorry, that she couldn't let him die, Nick hears none of it as justification, only as confirmation that his voice no longer mattered in the moment that counted most. And that sense of betrayal cuts deeper than any physical wound, because it strikes at the core of who Nick believes himself to be. And as the hours tick by and the chaos settles into an uneasy calm, the three of them trapped in the emotional wreckage of Nikki's choice, the unspoken questions grow louder, because Matt's survival is not a victory without cost. It is a ticking time bomb, one that threatens to expose the long-buried truth Nikki has spent years running from. And as Matt regains strength, his fragmented memories and halting words begin to hint at the depth of what Nikki has been hiding, revealing that his captivity was not random, not an isolated act of cruelty, but the final consequence of a chain of decisions Nikki made long ago when fear convinced her silence was safer than honesty. And this realization gnaws at her relentlessly, because saving Matt forces her to face the possibility that her desperate act of love was also an act of self-indictment, a confession written in violence rather than words. And Nick, watching her unravel, feels a cruel duality tearing him apart, because part of him understands his mother's terror and guilt, yet another part cannot forgive the way she stripped him of agency, reduced him to an obstacle rather than a son. And this internal conflict becomes unbearable when Victor inevitably enters the picture, his presence electrifying the tension, because Victor Newman does not see Nikki's actions as heroic or tragic, but as reckless, emotional, and destabilizing. And when he learns that Nikki attacked Nick to save Matt, his fury is ice-cold and surgical, directed not just at Nikki, but at the implication that Nick was weak, that control slipped, that the family narrative fractured in public and private ways that could have devastating repercussions, and Victor's response becomes yet another layer of pressure crushing Nick, because instead of comfort or validation, he is met with questions about why he allowed the situation to escalate, why he didn't anticipate Nikki's reaction, why he didn't neutralize the threat faster. And in that moment, Nick realizes with devastating clarity that Nikki wasn't entirely wrong, that Victor's philosophy has seeped into him more deeply than he ever wanted to admit, and this realization leaves him hollow, torn between anger at his mother and shame at himself, while Nikki, caught between husband and son, finally reaches the breaking point she has skirted for years, because the act of attacking Nick has stripped away her last illusion of control, forcing her to confront the truth that love alone cannot justify the damage she's done. And in a raw, unguarded moment, she begins to confess, not just to Victor or Nick but to herself, admitting that Matt's suffering was a direct result of her fear of exposure, that she allowed lies to calcify into fate, and that her need to protect the Newman image came at the cost of an innocent man's freedom. And as these confessions spill out, the family dynamic shifts irrevocably, because Nikki is no longer the moral anchor or the emotional glue she once was, but a deeply flawed woman standing naked in her regret, and Nick, hearing the truth, feels his anger war with compassion, because he sees the pain that drove his mother to this point, yet cannot ignore the scars her choices have left on him, on Matt, and on the family as a whole. And this tension reaches a devastating peak when Matt himself, now free but forever changed, confronts Nikki with a quiet, devastating honesty that hurts more than rage ever could, thanking her for saving him while acknowledging that her silence nearly destroyed him, a paradox that leaves Nikki shattered, because it confirms that redemption is never clean, never complete, and that saving someone does not erase the harm already done. And as word of the incident spreads through Genoa City, reactions ripple outward, with Victoria viewing Nikki's actions as a catastrophic failure of judgment that threatens the family's power, Sharon worrying about the emotional toll on Nick and whether he can recover from this betrayal, and others quietly questioning whether the Newman's brand of loyalty has finally imploded under the weight of its own secrets. And through it all, the image that lingers is that singular moment when Nikki raised her hand against Nick, because it symbolizes more than a mother's desperate act. It represents the ultimate collision of love and fear, the moment when the instinct to save one life shattered another relationship, and even as time moves forward, apologies are offered, and damage control begins. That moment cannot be undone, because Nick will always remember the look in his mother's eyes when she chose Matt over him, and Nikki will always carry the knowledge that in saving Matt, she wounded her son in a way that may never fully heal, making this storyline not just a shocking twist, but a profound exploration of how even the purest intentions can lead to irreversible consequences, cementing Nikki's attack on Nick as one of the most emotionally complex and haunting chapters in The Young and the Restless, a chapter that proves once again that in Genoa City, love is never simple, truth is never free, and every choice leaves scars that echo long after the moment has passed. As the dust continues to settle after Nikki's shocking decision to attack Nick and untie Matt, the emotional aftershocks deepen rather than fade, because in Genoa City, no action exists in isolation, and this moment becomes a fault line that slowly cracks open long-standing relationships, unspoken resentments, and fragile alliances, beginning with Nick himself, who retreats inward in the days that follow, haunted not by anger alone but by a profound sense of dislocation, because for the first time in his life, he no longer knows where he stands within his own family, and every memory of Nikki's hand striking him replays in his mind with unbearable clarity, not as violence but as rejection, as proof that when fear takes control, even a mother's love can turn conditional, and Nick begins to question every past moment where Nikki defended him, wondering now whether those moments were driven by love or convenience. And this internal unraveling affects everything he touches, from his strained conversations with Sharon, who senses his emotional withdrawal but cannot fully reach him, to his increasingly volatile interactions with Victor, whose cold, commanding presence now feels less like a father's strength and more like a looming warning of what Nick could become if he allows bitterness to calcify into control, and meanwhile, Nikki spirals in the opposite direction. Overwhelmed by remorse, yet paradoxically defensive, because admitting she was wrong means fully accepting that she crossed a line no mother should ever cross, and this psychological tug-of-war leaves her oscillating between tearful apologies and stubborn justifications, insisting she did what she had to do, that Matt would be dead otherwise, even as her voice breaks with the knowledge that her choice may have permanently altered her relationship with her son, and this emotional instability begins to alarm those closest to her, particularly Victoria, who views Nikki's actions through a lens of strategy and consequence, warning that the family's image, already fragile, cannot withstand another scandal rooted in emotional recklessness, and Victoria's judgment cuts Nikki deeply because it mirrors the harsh self-criticism she already carries, reinforcing the painful truth that in saving Matt, she may have destroyed her standing as the moral center of the Newman family, and as tensions mount, Matt's role in the story evolves from victim to catalyst, because his recovery brings clarity, and clarity brings accountability, and as he regains his strength, he begins to speak more openly about what he endured, revealing fragments of the past that Nikki desperately hoped would remain buried, including names, dates, and decisions that implicate not just her but the broader Newman culture of secrecy and control, and with every revelation, the question grows louder. How many lives have been quietly sacrificed to preserve the illusion of power, and Matt's quiet dignity in recounting his suffering stands in stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him, making Nikki's guilt heavier and Nick's anger more complicated, because while Nick cannot excuse his mother's violence, he cannot ignore the systemic cruelty that allowed Matt's suffering to happen in the first place, and this realization forces Nick into an uncomfortable reckoning with his own past choices, moments when he looked the other way, trusted the family machine to handle things, and told himself that staying involved meant he could prevent harm, even as harm continued unseen, and this self-awareness marks a turning point for Nick, because rather than retreat further into isolation or lash out in rage, he begins to distance himself from Victor's influence, questioning not just his father's decisions, but his own role in perpetuating a legacy built on fear rather than transparency, and this quiet rebellion does not go unnoticed, because Victor senses the shift immediately, interpreting Nick's introspection as weakness, and in a chilling exchange, Victor warns Nick that emotions cloud judgment and that Nikki's actions are proof of what happens when sentiment overrides discipline, a statement that horrifies Nick, because it confirms that Victor sees Nikki's attack not as a tragedy, but as a cautionary tale, and this ideological divide widens the rift between father and son, pushing Nick closer to a crossroads where he must choose whether to continue fighting for change from within the Newman Empire or walk away entirely. And Nikki, witnessing the growing distance between Victor and Nick, realizes with crushing clarity that her actions have accelerated a family fracture that was already forming, and this realization finally compels her to confront the truth without defensiveness, leading to a raw, unfiltered moment where she acknowledges not just to Nick, but to the entire family that she failed, that her fear of exposure led her to prioritize control over compassion for far too long, and that attacking Nick was the inevitable result of years spent suppressing guilt rather than addressing it, and while her confession does not absolve her, it shifts the emotional dynamic, because it forces the family to acknowledge that the problem extends beyond one violent moment to a culture that rewards silence and punishes vulnerability, and as this awareness spreads, subtle changes begin to emerge, with Sharon encouraging Nick to seek clarity rather than closure, reminding him that forgiveness does not require forgetting, and Matt, preparing to leave Genoa City, offering Nick a moment of unexpected solidarity, thanking him for trying to do the right thing even when it cost him, a gesture that deeply affects Nick because it affirms that his instincts, however flawed in execution, were rooted in empathy rather than control, and this validation becomes a quiet source of strength, allowing Nick to approach Nikki not with rage, but with guarded honesty, telling her that while he may one day forgive her, the wound she inflicted cannot be rushed to heal, and Nikki accepts this with tears and silence, understanding that accountability means living with uncertainty, and as the storyline moves forward, the significance of Nikki attacking Nick becomes clearer, not as an isolated act of desperation, but as a defining moment that exposed the fault lines beneath the Newman family's polished exterior, forcing each character to confront uncomfortable truths about love, power, and responsibility. And while Genoa City will inevitably move on to new crises, new betrayals, and new alliances, this moment lingers like an unresolved chord, a reminder that even the strongest families can fracture under the weight of their own secrets, and that sometimes the most devastating attacks are not born of hatred, but of love pushed beyond its breaking point, making Nikki's choice to save Matt at the cost of her son's trust a haunting, transformative chapter in The Young and the Restless, one that reshapes the characters involved and leaves viewers questioning where the line truly lies between doing what is necessary and doing what is right.